Stanford University.
I want to talk about how I think controversy and social commitment are important resources to utilize in the classroom. I want to give you some examples of how I have tried to use controversy and social commitment in the classroom. And then I want to give you my sense as to why I think it's important that we as faculty, all of us, whether graduate students, undergraduate students, professors, all of us as faculty in terms of having some teaching responsibility. Why it's important for all of us to think very carefully about how it is that we use controversy and social commitment as a way to engage our students, if not in fact our intellectual peers. There are, it seems to me, at least 3 keys to research, teaching, and learning. And not surprisingly, perhaps, I see research, teaching, and learning as being 3 very interactive ideas, 3 very interactive parts of our reality. Although there are those who might think of research as being separate from teaching and research and teaching being separate from learning, I think it's best to understand them as all, at best, slightly different dimensions of a largely the same enterprise. There are at least 3 keys to, I think, very good research, teaching, and learning. Energy, interest, and engagement. Energy, interest, and engagement. And these are not going to be particularly surprising to you. By energy, I mean the following. Having sufficient time, resources, and personnel. By energy, I mean having sufficient time, resources, personnel. And by personnel, I mean teachers, students, and overall learners. Having sufficient time, resources, teachers, students, and learners to be able to engage in a process of asking questions. So the energy that I'm referring to refers to largely having opportunities to interact with other individuals, but having those opportunities structured in a particular way. By interest, I'm referring to elements like ease or capability, challenge, background, what we might even call history. That is, what is it about the particular questions we may be addressing? What is it about the particular issues that we may be examining? What is it that might bring a student, what might bring a fellow co-learner to try to examine the particular question or issue? What is it that might drive, in other words, the interest that they have in examining the particular question or issue? I want to talk about some of these a little bit. By ease, I'm simply acknowledging that much of the learning that occurs at the university occurs because individuals go to where they seem to have the greatest success. One becomes an engineer because one is good at numbers, or one is good at problem solving. One is pre-med because one likes chemistry or biology. One is not pre-med or not an engineer, perhaps a political science major, because one has a particular ease at thinking of important issues in ways that do not necessarily lend themselves to one unique structure or interpretation. My bias in political science is to identify it as a particularly flexible area of study. For those who are very skilled at reading literature, analyzing literature, thinking about literature, then they may choose to focus in their own studies on literature. And of course, there are all sorts of combinations. The point I'm simply trying to acknowledge is that ease, I think, is an important way in which we need to appreciate how interest can develop. And of course, ease has important dimensions of capability under it. But interest can also be started, if you will. Interest can also be understood as largely coming from an individual's background, whether it's their intellectual background or their gender or their racial ethnic background or region of the country or class status. Background can influence us in many significant ways. One of the things that I always wondered about as an undergraduate student was trying to know more about my professors. Always wanted to know where they came from. You know, somehow they just appear in your life. You know, they just dropped on the particular stage in class. And I always thought if I knew a little more about the professor's background in terms of where they grew up, where they went to school, what their family life was like, I could probably anticipate much better why they were approaching the material in the way that they were approaching it, and particularly be better positioned to anticipate the sorts of questions they were going to ask on the examinations. I'd have a better sense, in other words, of what their reality is. The point that I'm trying to make is a simple one. We all have elements that structure the way we currently examine questions. We all have important elements of background to different degrees and in different ways that largely structure our interests as teachers. As co-learners, it's perhaps particularly important that we think about sharing that when we're in positions of leadership, in positions to try to structure the learning that is occurring. The other point that I'm trying to make there is to begin the process of questioning the idea that somehow the best intellectual work, the best scholars, the best teaching and learning, the best research is done by individuals who are completely above all of these things, like ease, capability, challenge, background, and their own history. There are the individuals who are, of course, most objective, the individuals who can see things from all possible different perspectives. Now, I'm not questioning the capability, questioning the reality that there are different degrees of objectivity, that there are different degrees of bias, that it's important for all of us to try to limit the extent to which we are bound to particular perspectives. But I also mean to suggest that one shouldn't, in a teaching and learning environment, try to give students the impression that their background, their experience, their ease, their challenge, their history cannot be a useful resource to examining questions and provide, in fact, greater insights to examining questions that then might otherwise occur. In other words, help them to understand how their backgrounds might serve to enhance the interests that they have. The third key, I think, is engagement. And by engagement, I mean trying to understand that in order to examine questions, it's necessary that there be a particular structure of understanding, a particular structure of interpersonal relationships, but a particular conceptual structure as well. Don't misunderstand me here. I'm not suggesting that there can only be one perspective, but I do mean to suggest that there has to be an environment, there has to be a way of organizing relationships that facilitates discussion, that facilitates questioning, and that facilitates, in particular, trying to find answers to those questions. Think of it in this fashion. Engagement, to me, largely refers to a structure that tries to allow all participants in it to make a strategic decision to participate, to make a strategic decision to become engaged, to make a strategic decision, and by strategic I mean based upon an assessment of costs and benefits, to make a strategic decision that it is worth someone's while to spend the time investigating this particular question. That, the capability or the chance to structure strategic decision-making requires that there be a clear, or at least more often than not, a clearer indication of expectations and responsibilities. What is it that we're going to be examining? How are we going to be examining it? What are the responsibilities of the instructor in this set of relationships? What are the responsibilities of the student? In a sense, what I'm talking about, of course, is the classroom and the sort of atmosphere that one allows to develop in the classroom, if not that one tries, in fact, to structure in some significant way. Now, what does this have to do with controversy and social commitment in the classroom? Well, as you might suspect by my comments already, I think it's important for us to understand that the modern academy that understands itself largely as perhaps best contributing to society when it sees itself as in an ivory tower, when it sees itself as above normal politics, when it sees itself as above the rough and tumble difficulties of politics and of controversy. When the modern academy tends to see itself in this way, it seems to me, it is not utilizing all of the opportunities that exist to mobilize energy, interest, and subsequently lead to engagement. What I'm suggesting, in other words, is that controversy can be used as a way of enhancing the amount of energy that comes to the classroom. It seems to me very appropriate for us to consider that controversy, if one understands controversy as the the possession of and existence of different points of view, the possession and existence of different ways of interpreting reality. It seems to me very, very possible that in today's society, controversy is heightened for a variety of reasons. Two come to my mind. There are many, but two come to mind. One is the tremendous advances in telecommunications and other technology all across the world, and related to that is the increasing competition for authority through governance. That is, to use a term that is overused, but I'll use it because I think it's inappropriate, the increasing role that all different forms of at least approaching democratic participation play in our society. What that means is there's more of an opportunity in our society today for different perspectives to be presented, for different perspectives to compete, and there's more opportunity, therefore, for these new and different perspectives to compete in a more symmetrical game. That is, to compete with one another, not so much as superiors and subordinates, surely that still occurs, but to have more opportunities to participate as combatants, to be co-equals, if you will. Given that circumstance, given that reality related to our politics generally, if not our societal development generally, and given the capability that controversies in so many different regions of our country, if not so many different parts of our world, can be seen and communicated within seconds all across the world, whether through email, whether through CNN. You know, one knows the stories, the very famous stories, right, when things were changing substantially in the former Soviet Union. The way that the Soviet military knew most of what was going on was by tuning into CNN to see what was being done, and there were reports coming out of the White House that that's what they did too. Talk to the individuals who had the reporters in the most different places all across the world. It just seems to me that controversy is something that we should expect, and perhaps something that we should embrace, something that is more likely and more possible in our society today. And notice how that works against the idea of the university as being an ivory tower. That is, the university as an ivory tower, if it is going to try to rise above that controversy, does it at a particular cost of what I would call relevance and saliency to the issues that affect real people's lives in real time, to the real issues that relate to, we might say, the distribution of social resources. Well, where does social commitment then come from this? Well, you can see how it follows, it seems to me, from the controversy, and we can see how social commitment can be an important part of that interest that I referred to before. It seems to me that with greater controversy, especially as groups continue to compete with each other for the formal authority of governance, it seems to me more likely that there are going to be challenges to the status quo. It seems to me more likely that there are going to be individuals who want a different distribution of resources that currently exist. Calls for changes in the status quo, for different distributions of resources, for different access and participation, should lead to equal claims for maintaining the status quo. And that's where the controversy results, right? It's the competition of groups in that fashion. It also should lead to very different visions as to what it is the new set of understandings should be. What it is the new set of understandings should try to accomplish. In other words, there is an increased opportunity, it seems to me, for social commitment, understanding social commitment as either commitment to current reality or a strong desire to change it in some way. And notice that I'm putting those on very equal planes. And I think it's important in thinking and teaching about these issues that we put them on an equal plane. It's extremely important that we understand that as flowing from what we might call an inevitable development in our society, what I referred to earlier regarding controversy. So social commitment and controversy, in other words, are two very important elements of our current reality that contribute to energy and interest. Now, how can we harness that in the classroom? Or what are the different ways in which we can think about harnessing that in the classroom? Particularly if one understands it, as I just suggested, where, in a sense, the classroom at the university is so protected and is such an artificial environment from the reality that we've just described. Well, in an ironic way, or at least a counterintuitive way, I want to suggest to you that it is, in fact, because the university is to a degree separated from controversy and social commitment in the real world of politics, that the classroom, in my view, becomes an ideal arena to engage with them. So that what I described earlier as a problem, if you will, of the university in being separate from that reality provides us a wonderful opportunity to engage perhaps in more constructive ways, or at least sufficiently constructive ways, with the complexities of that reality than we might otherwise anticipate. Well, why is that the case? Well, classrooms are places where reality is understood, where reality is discussed, where controversy and social commitment, where energy and interest and engagement are structured by a consideration of ideas. Not by raw power, although one could question the extent to which professors exercise raw power in the classroom. And we're all familiar with unfortunate circumstances where students try to use raw power to influence one another within the classroom. I'm not suggesting that those don't exist. But I do mean to suggest that the classroom is a place where it seems to me we have to be committed to making many different ideas, if not all ideas, equally able to have some place in the classroom. All different perspectives initially have equal weight, or should have equal weight, or should be given an opportunity at least to have some equal weight. The focus on ideas allows then for a focus, it seems to me, on interests, and allows us then to perhaps harness the energy that I referred to earlier. The classroom as an arena where the discussion of ideas, for it to be fruitful, is done through what I will characterize here as deliberation, which means people talking with one another and people arguing with one another, where agreement and disagreement occur, is a process of deliberation where I think we have to assume, for it to occur properly, we have to assume that it is largely a discussion that is rational. That is largely a discussion where people can agree and disagree with one another, but understand the basis of that agreement and disagreement. So that it's an arena where individuals are given an opportunity to express themselves, right? That's the focus on ideas and interests, are given an opportunity to express themselves, but there's no initial predetermination as to which ideas are in the end going to be most valuable to contribute to our understanding. There's an opportunity there for the different dimensions of social commitment. There's an opportunity there for controversy to enrich the overall discussion that occurs. There's an opportunity for deliberate, rational discussion. That isn't always the case. We just went through an election. That isn't always the case in the rough and tumble of the realpolitik, right? Isn't often the case in terms of how propositions are discussed in the larger public domain, where perspectives and the presentation of perspectives is determined largely on the basis of your capability to buy airtime, and how important or significant or how seriously the public takes your particular point of view is determined by how large your wallet is, how much airtime you're able to have, or it's determined on the basis of the extent to which candidates running for public office choose to adopt your particular point of view. And those candidates running for public office, who subsequently then are covered by the media, have then an opportunity to structure what the public discourse is. What I'm suggesting simply is that the classroom, because of its separation from that real politics, is at a very fundamental level an ideal arena to work with that controversy and social commitment. And it's also ideal, I think, and again, in a slightly counterintuitive way to what I just argued, it's also ideal because of the power dynamic. The power dynamic where you have an instructor who can set certain rules of discussion, certain rules of engagement. You have, the system allows, if you will, if you'll let me use the term the system allows for certain rules to be established by an authoritative figure. So that it's possible, if that authoritative figure is successful, and I'm not suggesting that authoritative figures, professors and teaching assistants in classrooms are always successful at this, but it's possible, if successful, it's possible to set a tone, to set rules, to set understandings in the classroom and in discussions related to the material in the course. It's possible to set rules that allow for this initial egalitarianism that I was referring to, that equal valuing of ideas. There's an opportunity, a tremendous opportunity, due to the asymmetry of power, to allow for ideas to be in more symmetrical position relative to one another. One can think of it as the ideal arena where there is an opportunity for a benevolent dictator to result. That is, for someone with responsibilities for structuring the curriculum, picking out which ideas students will actually read about, determining which issues will be examined, which time period will be covered, which authors presenting particular groups of perspectives. Say you have a group of authors who all feel the same way or argue the same way. Which authors get chosen to be read? There's a tremendous opportunity there for the instructor, it seems to me, to contribute to the extent to which the class can consider perspectives, consider interests, consider that controversy and social commitment in a more egalitarian way. And it's also an opportunity, through that structured authoritative relationship, for the instructor to allow for individuals to not only have their positions validated, to not only have their positions supported, to not only be given the opportunity to present their particular perspectives, to not only, in other words, allow for individual self-interest to be very clearly expressed. There's an opportunity for the instructor to have, as one of the expectations in the class, the need to overcome those differences. There's an opportunity to work on reconciliation, to work on resolving differences. There's the structured opportunity, in other words, for the instructor to try to work towards the resolution of differences rather than simply allowing them to be expressed and, if you will, somewhat exaggerated, fester. Or to allow individuals to feel validated but to not feel a responsibility for reconciling that validation with the validation of others that may be from a very different perspective. Now, what do I have? Well, okay, can I give you, and this is nice high-minded rhetoric, can I give you any examples of how one might try to do this? And what experience have I had in teaching over the last gosh, I don't know how long it is, I guess 12, 13 years, a long time. In teaching at universities over the last 12, 13 years, any examples that I can give of how I try to do this in my own classroom? Well, as Jack just mentioned, I teach in the areas of urban politics and policy, race and ethnicity, full of controversy and social commitment. You can't understand the evolution of urban politics in the United States of America, and my focus is largely on the United States of America, although I've done work in other countries as well. You can't understand the evolution of urban politics in the United States of America without understanding controversy and social commitment. You have to understand it in terms of competition for power. Not too surprising, I'm a political scientist, one would want to look at competition for power. But what's interesting about looking at it in the urban political environment is that it has been largely in urban areas in the United States where one has had the greatest levels of controversy and the greatest competition over what appropriate social commitment was. It is in urban areas in the United States historically where you have the greatest congregation of people with differences according to social class or social class status, the greatest variations according to race and ethnicity, the greatest variations between different interests, if you will, different private interests, small businesses, big businesses. It was in urban areas where you had tremendous concentrations of capital, the rise of the Industrial Revolution, the rise of the industrial working classes, the extent to which immigration affected the United States, the migration of many African Americans from the South to areas of the Northeast and the Midwest, as well as migration to urban areas in the South. It is in cities, in urban environments, where you get tremendous give and take historically to understand how controversy and social commitment has occurred. Cut that, as I suggested already, by race and ethnicity, and you have even more. Because as we all know, race, through slavery, race was always a fundamental part of how American society was structured. You can't have the Constitution of 1787 without slavery. You can't have the Union initially without slavery. You can't have the most clear determination of how the Union would be kept together initially in the Constitution of 1787 without understanding the tremendous way in which slavery allowed the South to be validated. Remember, slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation to the U.S. Congress. Reconciling differences right there through slavery, through race. What's been the greatest challenge to the subsequent evolution of the American polity? The Civil War. What was one important focus of the Civil War? Well, certainly slavery. So it comes in, race. Race comes in constantly, and it's why it is still such an important and relevant issue to us today, as we saw just in the election of 2 days ago. The point I'm trying to make is the area that I've worked in, it seems to me, to be understood, to adequately capture history, has to appreciate the significance of controversy and competition over what appropriate social commitment is. You can use the history as a way of helping students understand current controversy and current competition over social commitment. In a sense, you allow them to not to sound too deconstructionist, you allow them to contextualize themselves. You allow them to see how their reality may be different than what it was in the past, or more often than not, more similar to what has happened in the past. And you're able then to draw upon experiences, data, information, examples of the past. If you will, this focus upon history and the development of urban politics and race and ethnicity, need for conflict resolution among diverse interests, allows us to begin to work with the ways in which controversy and social commitment lead in the classroom to very real emotion and passion. And I want to mention emotion and passion because I think they're important. Clearly, when I talked about energy, time and resources, and certainly the combination of energy and interest, I was talking in part about emotion and passion. Emotion and passion in talking about social issues that have substantial controversy and social commitment associated with them often means hurt and guilt, or hurt and blame, or what we might call a logic of victimization. It's important to keep that in mind. It's important to think of how one can work with that in a more constructive way. The point that I'm trying to make here with regards to the presence of emotion and passion is that we understand emotion and passion associated with controversy and social commitment as being that we try to work to make them important resources. Important resources to enhance the discussion that is occurring in the classroom overall. Now, the final point I want to make with regards to the area I study, and then I'll finally give you an applied example of where I try to do this. The final point I want to make with regards to the area that I study is that it seems to me that we have an opportunity here, given the sorts of issues that I examine, we have an opportunity here in this artificial environment of the classroom to test out certain ways in which, perhaps in the larger society, this commitment and controversy, this interest and energy, ways in which they might be utilized for more constructive, larger social ends. By that I mean it's possible that the artificial environment of the classroom can be understood as a laboratory, to see what works, to contribute to greater discussion and engagement, to see what contributes to greater rational deliberation than the real world in fact allows us to do. Because of power, because of money, because of interest, because of how significant these issues are to people in real world time and real world interests. What I'm suggesting here is if one understands the utility of controversy and social commitment, one can see the classroom, and each class is different. By each class I mean each class period is different. One can see it as another test of one's ability to contribute in some way to the resolution of controversy and reconciliation of social commitment. Now notice the big bias that's introduced there. The big bias I'm introducing there is that controversy and social commitment as ends in and of themselves is insufficient. I'm not saying they're unworthy. I'm not saying they're unnecessary. I'm not saying that large gains cannot be made and tremendous understandings of social good cannot be achieved by focusing on controversy and social commitment. I'm saying that in teaching, in learning, and in research, it's important, at least to me, and I think to many others, that the focus on controversy and social commitment not be ends in and of themselves, but rather that they contribute to some larger understanding. The point there I'm trying to make, of course, is that the classroom's an ideal environment to do this for reasons that I mentioned before. Now, what can I give you as to any applied example of this? Well, I want to take one example of something I do in class that I have been doing now for at least 10 years that has filled itself with some controversy. I teach a course called Politics of Racial and Ethnic Politics in the United States. That's the title that it has here at Stanford. Racial and Ethnic Politics in the United States, where I pick out certain racial and ethnic groups and talk about the evolution of their politics here in the United States for the first half of the class. And the last half of the class, we look at a number of important issues, national issues, that have affected different racial and ethnic groups in the United States. The primary course requirement or primary piece of work that students have to produce in that class, there are a number of them, but the primary one is participation in a debate on affirmative action. I didn't dream this up. I've been doing this for 10 years. And I've been doing it for 10 years because when you examine, I'm rolling my eyes because of the recent vote 2 days ago, and the way in which that issue was discussed, in looking at the issue of affirmative action, it was filled with difference of opinion, filled with very legitimate difference of opinion, difference of interpretation, filled with tremendous amounts of controversy and battle with regards to what appropriate resolution of the goals of affirmative action should be. It was filled, if you will, with substantial amounts of difference of opinion regarding the nature of social commitment. So in structuring a debate on affirmative action, what I do is the following. I divide the class up into two sides, pro and con, those in support of affirmative action and those against. And I, as the instructor, decide who gets to be on which side. I pick the students and put the students on sides. They can't choose. Now, at the types of universities I've taught at, and the types of classes I tend to teach, there's a certain self-selection bias, I think, in students who sometimes appear in those classes. So I'm very concerned that if I allow students to choose, you'd get 95% of the students on one side and 5% on the other. So I split it right down the middle. Numerically, I split it right down the middle. And in doing that, in identifying those sides, I tell students that they're going to be responsible. They're going to be responsible not only for mastering the arguments on their particular side, but for becoming experts in a particular dimension of their side on this issue, the issue being affirmative action. That is, you're going to be an expert on African Americans and why African Americans might support it, or you're going to be an expert in why African Americans would not support affirmative action. So you have the dimensions cut across both pro and con sides. And I identify it by groups. I identify it by issue areas. We have someone examine higher education, someone examine employment, someone examine issues related to immigrants and immigrants' rights. We have someone examine it, as I said, by gender. We have someone examine it from the perspective of elementary and secondary education, where one tends not to think of affirmative action as being particularly relevant, but it's an important way of understanding what it is that affirmative action does or does not do. And I tell students that they have to be experts in that area by writing their paper from that particular perspective, demonstrating that they are, in fact, the experts in that area. But in the classroom, we have a traditional debate, where you have one side on this side of the table, the other side on the other side of the table, and to have an effective debate, it's necessary for those individual experts to work together to come up with common arguments. So part of what I'm doing as well is forcing the class, at least two halves of the class, to learn how to work together, how to use their individual expertise that they've been assigned to master to use that expertise, to see how that expertise can contribute to a better argument for their side overall. What am I doing there? What do I think I'm doing, I guess is what I should say. What do I think I'm doing there? Well, not surprisingly, one thing that I'm doing is trying to ask students, or rather force students, to understand an issue from a perspective that they don't already hold. I'm very sensitive to trying to assign students to be on sides that they otherwise would not argue. And I get a lot of resentment from students initially, and it's not that severe. I don't want to overstate it more. Maybe we should see some of the class evaluations and see whether it's overstated or not. But in any case, I require, or I use as my decision rule to place students in positions that they otherwise would not be in. Why do I do that? And when students come to me and say, why are you doing this? Look, this is where my interests are, this is where my passions, this is where my experience is. You know, you're being contradictory, right? You want to use background and promote interest, and here you are giving me an interest that's completely different from what I have. And I tell students, understand what's going on, at least what my logic is in the class. You don't argue your position as strongly as you can until you sufficiently appreciate the interest of the opposing side. You cannot fully understand what the merits are of your case until you can tell me better than you can understand the merits of your case, the merits of those who differ with you. And it's important that you understand the strengths and weaknesses in that position. And if you really understand your particular perspective, that is the initial perspective that you bring to the issue, not the one that I assign them, but your initial perspective, if you're really firmly convinced that your position on this issue is the right position, then you should know better than anyone else, not its strengths, you should know its weaknesses. That's when you really know whether you know what you're talking about. It's when you can anticipate what the criticism is going to be and you can effectively respond to it. So what are you doing? You're educating yourself in your own perspective as well, but fully appreciating the other side, and you're being forced to reconcile those perspectives with one another, and you're being forced to work with other people. And that's my other bias regarding controversy and social commitment. At one level, I said it's important that we focus upon resolution. Resolution requires individuals to work with each other. And it's not that often, at least in my experience, that in social science classes we ask students to work together in a substantial way as groups. But we do ask students to have study groups, and you can write your paper together, 2 or 3 people working together on a paper. But actually requiring group work in terms of group reconciliation in some important way, having a common goal in mind for more than 2 or 3 people doesn't happen that often. There are difficulties with that, right? You know, who did which work, who contributed most, this person never showed up to the meetings, there are organizational issues associated with doing this. I give that responsibility to the students and say, come and talk to me afterwards. And interestingly, students are particularly resourceful in trying to keep each other up to the same standards of work and making sure that everyone contributes. And if you will, the differences in contribution are, in my opinion, acceptable levels of, for lack of a better term, noise in this situation, such that the overall end is still worthy. What am I doing? Well, clearly I'm trying to use counterintuitive arguments, counterintuitive positions as a way to engage students more directly with the material. Using controversy and social commitment, whatever it is, whatever side it is, using that controversy and social commitment as a way to enhance their capability to participate, but also as a way to enhance their capability to work with each other in reconciliation of what the best argument is, and ultimately as a class in reconciliation as to what the best arguments are for the case. Now, how then does the actual debate work? I play, are any of you familiar with the series that Fred Friendly did on PBS, and maybe still does on PBS? I haven't seen him recently. Charles Ogletree, member of our Board of Trustees, was often where you'd have 15 to 20 people sitting there, and he would come up with hypothetical situations. You kind of play law professor, in a sense. Hypothetical situations. Here's a case. Let me tell you the facts of the case. And then you ask questions of individuals or of the sides and say, how would you respond to this particular case? As an example, is it necessary for historically black colleges to have affirmative action programs for Latinos, Native Americans, and recent immigrants, as a scenario? What do you do in a circumstance where a case of a female police officer who has been put to work with a sergeant, a male, to ride with her as part of her training, and this person is assessed very negatively because she has not performed particularly well, but there is a consent decree requiring that gender be taken into account for purposes of appointment and promotion. How would you respond to those situations? In other words, I try to pick out scenarios that themselves are a bit counterintuitive, that are not easily answerable, where differences of opinion should contribute to some greater understanding regardless of what your particular position might be. In a sense, what I think it does is that it forces students, all students in the class, to try to understand the issue. Now, all students want to win, right? Now, it's amazing to me how people, when they're assigned to a particular side, want to win. You know, if it's completely different from their own private perspective, they want to win, and their side has to win, and their side has to be the best. It pushes students, I think, in their desire to win. It pushes them to see things from perspectives that they wouldn't otherwise see them from. But ultimately, for an issue like affirmative action, where, at least in my view, there is not an easy, simple answer as much as many individuals would like to find one, it pushes people to think of, okay, how are we going to work towards finding an appropriate answer? How are we going to work towards reconciling these differences of opinion, or do we all have to separate as to what our appropriate opinions are? Some final comments. The other point that I want to make with regarding this focus on using controversy and social commitment in the classroom is that because each class is different, you have an opportunity for continuous diagnosis. Diagnostic information is there all the time. So it's important to see what works and what doesn't, and to reconsider what works and what doesn't, and to improve upon that. Now, there are some caveats, and I want to note two for you. The first is unpredictability. You never know what's going to happen. Folks go ballistic. Sometimes. People cry at times in talking about issues, in analyzing and intellectually analyzing issues, important social issues, when you allow controversy and social commitment to be an important part of what's going on. And you have to be prepared for that. And you have to be prepared in terms of that unpredictability for what I will refer to here and others have referred to as the overexpression of individual perspectives, or what I like to refer to as essentializing, where someone says, because I am person of background X or person of view X, this is the view, and there is no other view, and how dare anyone question my view? It is my view, and my view is valid. It is my perspective. No question about that. That view is that person's view. That view is valid. But that's no reason. That doesn't suggest any reason as to why that view cannot be expressed. And there I think the instructor is in a very important role to play in limiting the extent to which that sort of essentializing dominates subsequent discussion. And the way I do it is, I ask the tough questions. When someone says, you can't question my view, or you, fellow student, can't question my view, I'll question the view. And the authoritative relationship comes back in to try to work towards a more, what we might call a less emotional discussion. Not that one wants to get rid of the emotion, that's not what I'm saying at all, but it has to be at an acceptable level, where in fact reality can be questioned, can be debated, can be talked about, can be discussed from these different perspectives. Now, the unpredictability, the advice that I have there as to how to deal with the unpredictability is to have faith in the future. That is, as you do it more often, you get better at it. And there are a few lumps along the way, particularly early on, and one learns some important lessons. But notice, and again, in the role of the critical role of the instructor, notice, and I'm running out of time here, notice that the instructor is in a very important position to set the tone for the discussion of issues in the classroom. And all eyes are on you, especially for the first 2 or 3 weeks of class, in my experience, to see how you approach your own perspective and how valid you allow other perspectives to be, or whether your perspective is the only one that is allowed to gain any position in the class. And notice I'm not suggesting that it's necessary for the instructor not to have any particular position. I think that's worse than taking a strong position, because then the class tries to guess, you know, what the professor's position is, and it becomes a guessing game rather than a learning experience. But I think that the instructor is in an ideal position to try to limit the extent to which the unpredictability is unmanageable, or the essentializing gets to be too much of an extreme. Well, finally, what can I say? It seems to me that what I try to do in using controversy and social commitment in the classroom is to simply acknowledge the multidimensional reality that exists in our society, in an artificial environment, that is in the classroom. I try to acknowledge that that variety of opinions, that variety of perspectives that exists. I try to acknowledge that and utilize that. But I do it in an arena where it doesn't come at the cost of someone losing their lives, doesn't come at the cost of someone not being able to get a job, or not being able to gain admission necessarily. The classroom is an artificial environment in which this sort of a discussion can occur. Notice, I'm suggesting that it's important in our teaching and research here in focusing on controversy and social commitment that we understand multidimensionality of the multidimensionality of reality, alliteration there, in a way different than what might lead to tenure. For those, since many of you are concerned about it or have attained it. That is, it's very often the case that what one publishes or what the academy values is understood in a very unidimensional way. A perspective, an idea, a way, the answer. I'm suggesting that, that one understand that in the classroom at least, if not in fact in one's own research, there may be more opportunities for multidimensionality than we think. I think it is the better understanding of the diverse popular interests, ambiguities, hopes, and in the end commonalities that controversy and social commitment help us try to attain. Why don't I stop there? Take any questions that you might have. Force them to be. Make their grade dependent on it. Students respond very quickly and very easily to clear expectations of what they need to produce. If mastering a number of different perspectives is important in the understanding of this particular issue, set that up as a standard. When you talk about whatever your issue is, let's assume that it's democratization in the former Soviet Union. When you talk about the issue, you present the 2 million different perspectives that exist, the 10 different perspectives as to whether or not this was good or bad or what the consequences are going to be. And you say, on the examination, you're going to have to talk about 6. So that you have a clear set of expectations at the front, that you have to look at things from different perspectives, that you have to understand the complexity, maybe not in its totality, right, but at least in a substantial part of its totality. And the students see that and say, okay, now I know what the rules are. So I'm not going to throw up my hands and say it's too complex. You've given me a way to try to make that complexity more manageable. The other way to get at that is when there does seem to be such a variety of perspectives and difference of interest, you're in a position there to narrow them down a bit analytically in the initial discussion of what's going on. To say, look, there are 25 different authors here, but basically there are 3 dimensions of argument. And let me tell you what those 3 main dimensions are and how those authors then differ at the margins with one another, but basically there are 3 dimensions here that one tries to get at. In my experience, if your level of energy and interest is high, you the instructor, it has ripple effects on the students. How you talk about the material, what your level of engagement is with the material. I'm not talking about your own biased perspective, but rather how you talk about the multiplicity that's there and how you deal with it gives students very significant cues as to how they might do the same. I let the students think I do. I'm violating what I said before about being clear on expectations. I let the students think that their actual participation on the day or days of the debate, and sometimes it's over 2 class periods, that is very much going to affect their grade. I don't say 25% and then not count it. I'm not saying that, right? But I just say this is important. It's important that you all try to do your best. Yeah, I'm going to look to see who participates most and who the leaders seem to be, that sort of thing, as part of your overall, as part of the overall assessment of your class participation. Certainly, the written portion of your work will be graded very carefully, and there you're presenting your particular perspective. And students very often say then, well, can I talk about what my real view is? And I said, of course you can, after you talk about what you were assigned. Then if you want to add another section, that's absolutely fair. I'll grade that as well and appropriately. I find it difficult to give individual grades to people on the basis of their participation in a debate. I also have always felt uncomfortable asking each student to speak for the same period of time, kind of the classic debate style, we say you get 2 minutes and you get 3 minutes, 30-second response, 30-second response, 2 minutes there, that sort of artificial thing. I've just not felt comfortable with that because it really inhibits the way in which people can engage, in my view, with the material. I already have a sense, I think, a pretty good sense. The one thing I do that I didn't mention is that I meet with each side of the debate before the debate, and I play devil's advocate with them. And, all the students on the pro side, all the students on the con side, separate from each other. Let's talk. What do you know? What do you understand? Have you looked at these issues? What do you, what's your source of evidence? Have you updated the information that you have? That sort of thing. So that they get a sense of high expectations of the level of the debate, not knowing what the other side's going to do. Now, occasionally, the side that I speak to second wants to, tries to pick my brain to see what I told the first side, right? And trying to get secret information and espionage, and there's been all sorts of things about, who spoke to the roommate and things of that sort. But I find it very difficult to assess individual performance because that's such a, for lack of a better term, give and take environment. What happens afterwards, though, is that I ask the class who won. And with surprising consistency, students will agree as to which side won, or which dimension of the issue seemed to carry the greatest weight in terms of the evidence presented, the way it was argued, and the capability of the other side to respond or critique the particular perspective that was there. I do it in a couple of ways. First, I let them know very clearly, and some would suggest a bit too bluntly, as to when they are presenting an assertion and the difference between an assertion and an argument. And I don't think all of our students, particularly undergraduate students, a number of our graduate students too, but particularly undergraduate students, appreciate the difference. If you say, we're going to value differences of opinion, it's, whatever I want to say is fine, and it's my opinion, and you have to deal with it. And I say, in scholarship, in academic argument, that doesn't carry very much weight, unless you're the president of the university or the chair of the department. That doesn't carry a great deal of weight in helping people understand and appreciate what your perspective is. And unless you are the person in ultimate power and authority, your influence is going to be determined on the basis of your capability to build coalition partners. And coalition partners cannot join you if they don't understand where you're coming from. So that it enhances the value of your position to be able to convince others that your position is in fact the one that is significant. I let students know when they're making weak arguments, and let students know that it's okay for them to tell their peers that they're making weak arguments, with appropriate, discretion and respect, but firmly. That's not convincing to me. You didn't address my question. What we would all like to see reporters do when they're interviewing candidates for public office. Answer the question, quit giving me these canned answers. That sort of thing. I let them know that that's okay, and it's my responsibility to make sure that it doesn't get out of control, or that the power dynamic in the classroom in terms of someone speaking more often or more loudly, or being the largest person, which often happens. Physical size sometimes intimidates other students. I find that just how one talks to someone else and whether one sits up and so forth, and very important gender dynamics can occur there, as well as other sorts of cultural dynamics occur. It's my responsibility to try to keep that under some reasonable level of control. Any other questions?
I'd like to thank Luis Braga for appearing today.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.